Today's passage from Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 to 33, the emphasis is about submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. Paul instructs us all to submit to one another in Ephesians 5, verses 21. In verse 23 to 33, Paul uses the example of the church to show wives how to respect and submit to their husbands, and the example of Christ to show husbands how to love and sacrifice for their wives. This text can be quite difficult to hear in today's culture, but it's also fantastic because as the example of Christ and the church teaches us about marriage, this helps us better understand the marriage between Christ and the church. Although the passage does focus on the relationship between a man and a wife, it also looks at the fundamentals of human relationships that can be applied to any relationships and how love for others should be at the center. So Paul begins in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21 by telling us to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Paul speaks similarly in Colossians chapter 3, verse 23 to 24. It says, "Wherever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward." You are serving the Lord Christ. So whatever we do, we are supposed to do it as if we were doing it for the Lord. The command is to love God with all our hearts, all our soul, and all our might. This may seem impossible because we have relationships and responsibilities that are not with God. But we demonstrate this love for God when, despite obstacles, because we love God with all our heart, we live out these relationships and responsibilities how God commands us to. Our love for Christ is demonstrated in how we work, how we treat our spouses, how we interact with our kids, parents, church, and the lost. The parable in Matthew chapter 25, verse 31 to 46 teaches us this parable. And part of this parable says this: "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." So if we do not show love to the least of other people, we do not love Jesus. In as much as we love the least of other people, we love Jesus. This is a true story I'm about to give here. After this last Christmas, I went back to my village in Tanzania. While there, I went to see a man who everyone calls a thief. He was in prison for 6 years, about 30 years ago. And even though he is a completely changed man, people still point fingers and call him a thief. He completely stopped associating himself with people anymore. When I went to see him, he told me something that will stay with me forever. He said this: "Charles, thank you for coming to see me when I was in prison and giving me something, some financial assistance. He then mentioned the amount that I gave him. It wasn't much, but clearly that action remained with him. I must admit, I had no hint of recollection of going to visit him. But then he said he wanted to start going to church. However, he would like to go with someone who can be next to him and be there for him. So I said, okay, I'll find someone to take you. I'll find somebody, I'll speak to somebody who may be able to go with you and be closer to you. I then prayed for him and asked Jesus to guide him. I do believe he accepted Jesus in his life, as after the prayer, he was sobbing. But the sad part of this story is that 3 days later, I received a message to say that this man, who was called Matungwa, drowned in Lake Victoria while fishing and died. What a tragedy. I believe, as the Bible put it, kindness that we do to vulnerable people, they do remember. And it makes a difference in their lives. And when we are doing it for the vulnerable, we are doing it for Jesus. So please, I'd like to encourage you, don't stop serving others with a compassionate heart, because by doing so, we are serving God. This principle of serving or submitting to one another is very present in marriage. But in the thick of daily marital life, struggles and disagreements, it is very difficult to remember this. At times, we may find ourselves only thinking of the treatment we deserve and what they don't deserve. How are we supposed to love a spouse when our spouse treats us poorly? We might be right in our estimation of them, but God does not command us to love or respect our spouse based on their worthiness. Next time we show kindness, make a sacrifice, take a spiritual leadership, speak kindly, submit our will, serve a spouse, or surprise them with a gift. Please, let us not make it about what they deserve. When we love our spouses, let us make it a statement about our reverence and love for Christ. If we only love those who love us, what reward do we have? We have a great reward and show we truly love God when we love, sacrifice, respect, and submit to our spouses when we believe they deserve it the least. Using Christ as an example, Paul speaks in verse 25 to 33 of how Christ sacrificed himself and cleansed the church. The reason Christ did this is because we, the church, are his body. Do we typically hate our body and refuse to care for it? No, we don't. In fact, we try to take care of our body. Even if we do it poorly, or sometimes poorly, we will do anything to feed our body when it is hungry and clean our body when it is dirty. Even though we were hungry, in danger, and dirty, Christ sacrificed himself to change this because we are his body. Christ actually shows his greatest love for us when we are not well, because it only hurts him if he watches us perish. How a marriage can unify two people peacefully may be a mystery to the world, but following this example is the only way two can successfully become one. It is only beneficial for two to become one when they actually treat each other like they treat their own body. Sadly, sometimes marriages have not been a good example to demonstrate Christ's church. But Paul is reminding us that we should treat marriage with respect and honor it as Christ did. Paul is giving husbands a warning and asking us to be better. In Ephesians chapter 5 verse 28, it states this: in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. So Paul applies this to husbands. But wives can also learn from this. If we are married, we are one flesh with our spouse. If we are treated poorly by our spouse, for some reason we may want to make a great statement about it by treating them poorly in return. While we should communicate our heart to our spouse, we are only hurting ourselves if we hurt them. If we instead love and serve them, we are actually helping ourselves. When we are discouraged with our spouse and with marriage, let's use this as a motivation. When we actively love them, no matter what, we are at least preventing ourselves from being destroyed. Let us adopt a new perspective. When we see our spouse, let us see them as our own body. God has put us in a relationship which becomes a battle when we are selfish. And we have to learn and grow to preserve the marriage. Though Paul is talking about mutual submission in Ephesians 5 in verse 21, it then goes on in verse 22 to 24 to emphasize the need for wives to submit to their husbands. We are not sure why Paul does this. We're not sure why exactly. Because Paul doesn't tell us. But given the contextual nature of Paul's letters, it is likely that he was writing to address specific issues the church was facing. When we read various texts, we can see that the church in Ephesus was having problems with false teachers. And many of these were women who were abusing that newfound freedom in Christ. It is clear that something wrong was happening around that time. Paul quickly moves on and instructs husbands to love their wives. He moves from submission language in verse 22 to 24 to the language of love in verse 25 to 33. He says, in so doing, he is not softening his instructions to the men, but intensifying them. And according to the broader context of the passage, there was something wrong with the men in Ephesus. Men, they needed to be instructed to love their wives. In verse 5 to 25 to 33, it explained that they were to discipline their children with gentleness and godly instructions. in verse 6 to 4, in verse 6 to 4, that the word gently have to treat and instruct the children faithfully, with gentleness, and to treat their slaves with dignity, which speaks about in verse 6 to 9. So in chapter 6, verse 9. We will hear more about this when Chris speaks. Paul seeks to break this pattern by appealing to Jesus as the model of selfless love. Just as Christ loved the church and gave up his own life to save her, so husbands are called to love and serve their wives. In this culture around that time, husbands had relatively few obligations in a home beyond providing food and shelter. And the women were generally regarded as inferior. They were expected to take the religion of their husbands. They were often viewed as less intelligent and less moral, a source of sin and continuing temptation for men. Paul is speaking into this context and is seeking to challenge it. By giving this picture of asking husbands to love their wives as Christ loves the church, it shows that love goes with sacrifice. How much do we sacrifice for one another? Paul is challenging the attitude of these men who were taking for granted the relationship they have with their wives. He's saying we should be ready even to suffer at any cost for our loved ones. My friends, I'm not sure if there's anything we can do to beat that. I don't think there's anything better than that. Nobody can beat that cost. Why does Paul think it is important to compare our human relationships of marriage to that of Christ's love? I think it is because Paul understands that these relationships are costly, and the only true example of unconditional love is Christ himself. Why? Because Christ loved us so much that death was nothing compared to the love he had for us. In marriage, there's a need to serve one another. But throughout the New Testament, there is the call for us as Christians to serve all others and put others before ourselves. If we remember Ephesians 2, verse 5, it insisted on a servant mentality in imitation of Jesus. It says this: whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. I think we are all reminded that we need to serve one another. When in any kind of relationship, serving others must be a priority. If we prioritize to serve others, that means we will be served too. Our church community should be distinctive in the servant attitude, which is very contrary to the individualistic, it is all about me culture that we live in. If we were striving to always put the needs of others before our own, we demonstrate to those around us this servant heart that Jesus so perfectly demonstrated throughout his life and ministry. May God help us to do this with compassionate heart and gentleness. Amen.